Hi, my friends. Welcome to Deep Six, the Deep State, my daily commentary on the news of the day. Again, my best wishes to Renee, who usually helps me with these broadcasts, but she's under the weather. So if you make a comment, wish her to get better soon. We miss her. The major development in this ongoing Uranium One scandal is that Fusion paid journalists. Now, Fusion claims that that was for research, that they were hiring them to do research about Russians and uranium and all of that. But the fact of the matter is that they admit to actually paying journalists. And my belief is that they were paying them to promote the phony collusion story between Trump and Fusion. The way we found out that they were paying journalists is that the people who launched the civil suit against against Fusion for libel said that there was evidence that they had paid journalists, and the Fusion refused to produce their books, and then pursuant to a court order, they had to produce them, I believe, to the House Intelligence Committee. And the committee dug through them and concluded that there were at least 3 prominent journalists who received money from Fusion, either for research, which would be borderline kosher, or for covering the story, which would be outrageous and undisclosed and really force those journalists out of the profession. A low bar anyway to be a journalist, but you can even go lower than that bar. It's kind of limbo, like a limbo contest. But this is terribly serious. It means that not only did Fusion use the money from the Hillary campaign to fabricate the charges in the dossier, but it also used the money from the Hillary campaign to pay journalists, very likely, to promote that story, to feed the story. And we don't know the names of the journalists. Eileen speculates as to one of them and has pretty good cause for thinking of that person. I can't say it now without further proof, but you would know the name, and it would be common knowledge to anybody who's followed politics for the last 30 years. And if there was any payoffs of that sort going on, this is really important. Bear in mind that in most third world countries, payoffs to journalists are routine. And every government, when it takes office, and every political party, has its journalists on the pad, who it's paying to generate positive coverage according to their political needs. And we fortunately don't have that in the United States. I'm not even sure whether it's legal or illegal, but we don't have it. And thank goodness we don't have it, because we can at least depend on the idea that their lack of objectivity is genuine rather than bought and paid for. That relying on them to tell the truth is, again, too high a standard, but not to be bribed and just to be oriented philosophically in a certain direction is the best we can probably hope for. But this is terribly, terribly serious, and we need to explore it. It also raises the question of whether these were in fact bribes paid by Hillary and her campaign, routed through Fusion to go to these journalists to generate coverage about the phony Trump dossier. In other words, they cooked up the scandal on the one hand and then propagated it on the other through these payoffs. And to give you an idea of the magnitude we're talking about, we know that the Hillary campaign paid Fusion a touch over $1 million. I think it's $1,025,000. And we know that the spy who persecuted or pursued this scandal, Christopher Steele, was paid $160,000. So you have about $800,000 unaccounted for, and that may well have gone either to pay the sources of information for the dossier or to pay the journalists to promulgate the dossier and give it good coverage and hype it in the media and make it into the scandal that it has since become, or both. And it raises serious questions about the integrity of the Clinton campaign and about the entire process of that journalists covering this, which we all know is stacked. But we used to think it was stacked honestly, and just their opinions. whereas now it appears that they may have been bought and paid for. The other piece of information that's new is that the effort to get approval to sell our uranium to the Russians was only one part of a broad effort that was undertaken to get the Russians much of our uranium supply and to help Putin monopolize the global uranium supply. FBI Task Force Supervising Campbell, that's Donald Campbell, the FBI informant who's going to testify soon, since 2008 watched as the Obama administration made more than half a dozen decisions favorable to Russia's plan. This is from The Hill, which is exposing all of this, which ranged from approving the sale of Uranium-1, which Hillary did, to removing Rosatom, the Russian atomic agency, from export restrictions and making it easier for Moscow to win billions in new commercial uranium sales contracts. And the decision to do that came when Obama and Hillary were pursuing their reset policy with Russia. And that reset apparently involved turning over a lot of control over our uranium supply. All the while understanding that Putin's goal was to exercise a global control over the uranium supply, akin to Saudi Arabia's power over oil, so that we would be over a barrel, so to speak, to get the uranium, just like we were to get the oil and still are to a certain extent from Saudi Arabia. There is also, I alluded to this yesterday, but I didn't have the actual quote in front of me, a clear, call it a mistake, call it a misrepresentation, or call it a lie, by Jeff Sessions, the AG, and Rod Rosenstein, the deputy AG, in their testimony before Congress. Sessions and Rosenstein, in a letter to the Senate last month, this is The Hill, tried to suggest that there was no connection between Uranium-1 and the nuclear bribery case. That's the bribery case where this guy, Campbell, infiltrated these various firms and noted the bribes that were going on to trucking firms and various other uranium outlets. And the Uranium-1 deal, which was the purchase of the rights by Russia to our uranium. They tried to suggest there was no connection. Their argument was that the criminal charges about the bribery were not filed until 2014, while the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States, Hillary's outfits, approval of the Uranium-1 sale occurred in October 2010. Specifically, Sessions said, "The way I understand that matter is that the case in which Mr. Murkin, that's the guy who was involved in the bribery, the Russian, was convicted was not connected to the CFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States problem that occurred 2 to 3 years before. But investigative records show FBI counterintelligence recorded the first illicit payments in the bribery kickback scheme in November 2009, a year before the CFIUS approval." This is Rod DeSantis, Republican congressman from Florida, said there is zero doubt we have evidence of criminal activity before the CFIUS approval, and that Justice knew about it through the National Security Division. Attorney General Sessions seemed to say that the bribery, racketeering, and money laundering offenses involving 10X's Vladimir Murkin, the Russian we just spoke about, occurred after the approval of the Uranium-1 deal by the Obama administration. But we know that the FBI's confidential informant was actively compiling incriminating evidence as far back as 2009. It is hard to fathom, this is still DeSantis, how such a transaction could have been approved without the existence of the underlying corruption being disclosed. And Senator Grassley said, "The essential question is whether the Obama Justice Department provided notice of the criminal activity of certain officials before the CFIUS approval of the Uranium-1 deal and other government decisions that enabled the Russians to trade nuclear materials in the United States." So you get it? The FBI was investigating this stuff. They had an informant who was reporting to them. And a year after the reports started to flow and they began to realize there was bribery going on here, the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States, headed by Hillary, considered and approved the sale of the Uranium uranium to the Russians. And nobody from the FBI ever told them that there was an ongoing investigation of bribery. And which is not in this story, but is also true, is that if they could prove that there was this bribery going on, which we probably could, not in a court, but in the FBI, that would bar the Uranium One sale. So information that would have stopped this sale was covered up by the FBI. Now, that may be Hillary's scandal, but it sure as hell is Mueller's scandal, because he was in charge of the FBI while this was going on. And he was sitting there red-handed with this information, not willing to tell the Committee on Foreign Investments what the heck was going on. And you'll hear more about this when we have a hearing with Campbell testifying. But this is pretty heavy stuff. Now, I want to just spend a minute on Roy Moore, because I'm backtracking. 2 days ago, I said that I didn't care whether he did it or not. The important thing was that we not lose the seat to the Democratic Party. And I cited previous examples, like McCaskill beating Aiken. Aiken was the Republican, McCaskill, the incumbent Democratic senator in Missouri. And what happened there is that Aiken made a ridiculous comment saying, if a woman is raped, her body will stop her from getting pregnant. And then an equally nonsensical statement by Richard Murdoch, who was running for Senate against Joe Donnelly in Indiana, said that he did not believe that he believed that when a woman was raped, it was the will of God, and therefore you shouldn't intervene to try to stop the birth. And both of these statements were featured widely and cost us the seat. Both of these seats ought to have been ones the Republicans won, but we lost them, and McCaskill and Donnelly, the two Democrats, now represent Missouri and Indiana in the U.S. Senate. And I was hoping that this would not be the case with Roy Moore. Now there's been an accusation by a very credible guy who I've trusted over the years, who is the consultant to Roy Moore. And I've worked with him, and I like his work, and I believe him. And he said that he believes Fox News is jimmying its polls to try to cast aspersions on Moore's chances of winning by saying that Moore is falling, and that his opponent is rising, and that Moore is going to lose the seat for the Republicans if he stays in the race. Now, that could well be true, but I'm basing the idea that it might be true just on the fact that it's not often that pollsters completely make up data. But this may be an example of that, because it's so fraught with partisan implications. I think that ultimately the dynamics of this race, forgetting the polling, are in Moore's favor. And I've come to think that over the last 2 or 3 days as I've watched this stuff unfold. When you're trying to assess what's going to happen in an election where you're not running the campaign, you can't really control it, you can just watch it, you have to look at the way the information flows. And here the information flows pro-Moore rather than anti-Moore. You first learn that there's a guy named Roy Moore and that he wants to be a senator and that he's won the Republican primary, and then you learn that all these women are accusing him, one after the other, with various degrees of evidence and certitude about varying degrees of misconduct. And you learn about that, and you're shocked. You rock back and you say, oh my God, what have we gotten ourselves into? Who is this guy, and why should we elect a man like that to the U.S. Senate? But after that, all of the other information that comes out tends to vindicate Moore. There are questions about one of the victims' description of the location of the parking lot where the so-called rape may have occurred, and it turns out it couldn't have been there. And it couldn't have been at the hours she specified for various reasons. And as you delve into the story, you find inconsistencies that really influence your view of the case. And then you see Trump coming out, basically in support of Moore, echoing the view that I took earlier in the week, which is it is not worth doing this to get a liberal Democrat in the Senate who will vote against the tax cut and in favor of keeping Obamacare and against the entire Trump agenda and be the key vote, the swing vote. In other words, with this election, we have the potential of losing the entire U.S. Senate because of this. And unless you have pretty damn good proof, you don't want to advocate that course of action. And then you look at the environment. I think that people are watching Charlie Rose and Al Franken, and they're saying, my God, this goes all over the place. There are so many examples of this all over. And the factor of outrage that would be the case if this were the only one tends to be muted a little bit. And the result is, I think, that first Moore is riding high, then he crashes, and then he gradually comes back. And the polling, to whatever extent you can trust it, indicates that. Because Moore was 11 points ahead, then he was 8 ahead, then he was 12 behind. Now Fox News has him back at only 6 behind. And it may be that the voters are learning more about the scandal, and they're also learning who the alternative is, who this guy Scott is, who's his adversary. I think his name is Scott. And we're learning that he has a record that you may not want to approve of, and Trump is taking shots at him. And as a result, you kind of rethink that, and maybe with a strongly Republican electorate, like they have in Alabama, Moore is rebounding. Also, you realize the election isn't until December 12th, so we're talking about something that is more than 2 weeks away. And with that in mind, let's not come to snap decisions on this. So let's watch the evidence, see what comes out, see specifically if Moore is going to lose this election. And if he might, then to support him to stop the seat from going liberal and Democrat. If he's a cooked goose and the scandal has killed him and he's got no chance, then we should cut our losses and try to stop the Democrat from winning the seat, maybe by postponing the election. But not so fast. Let's have a look at this and let's understand it a little bit better. Now, I think that it's important for us to understand just how fundamentally the Republicans have managed to control stuff. We know that the Republicans control the House and the Senate and the White House. But beneath that, there has been a virtual wipeout of the Democratic Party because it's been steered so far to the left in such a crazy direction under Obama that really nobody can vote for it. So the Republicans now control 67 houses of state legislatures. There are 50 states. There are 2 houses in each state except Nebraska that just has 1. So of those 99 legislative chambers, 67 of them, 2/3 of them, are controlled by Republicans, which is unbelievable. It's more than twice the number where Democrats have the majority. There are currently 34 Republican governors, only 15 Democrats and 1 independent. And the Republican National Committee has outraised the Democratic Committee by more than $50 million this year, largely fueled by small donor contributions. And as a result, the Republican Party has $44 million on hand, while the Democrats have 7 with a debt of $4 million. And we need to keep that going. It's very clear that this is not a reaction to Obama, but a wave of Republican support. And that's a very good thing. Now, there is a major financial issue shaping up that I'd like to explain a little bit. There is a big problem, as you know, all over the country of pension funds that face bankruptcy, where people paid in the money to get their pension, and the employer paid in the money he was obliged to, but it never caught up with the needs of the pensioners, either because of cost of living increases or because of the decrease in earnings by the pension funds because there was no inflation, and they weren't, in many cases, permitted to invest in stocks, as Bush urged them to, which would have solved and avoided this problem because the stock market's gone crazy. But with the bond market and the other stuff being fairly tepid in its gains, those pension funds have fallen behind and face bankruptcy. Now, if they go bankrupt, what's going to happen politically, obviously, is we're going to have to pay for it as taxpayers. Congress set up something called ERISA a decade ago, which was a pension insurance scheme, where every year the pension funds paid half of 1% to this fund that existed to bail out pensions that had failed so that the retirees can continue to get benefits. But the reserves of that fund are minuscule compared to the exposure. It's something like 40 billion in reserves and 400 or 500 billion in exposure should these pensions go broke. And the question is, if they do go broke, who ends up paying the bill? The taxpayer or the pensioner or the company or the stockholders? Now, the Republicans passed a bill that said that where there are multiple employers, like a trucking business, for example, where you have several different trucking firms, but the Teamsters Union has one pension fund, that in those cases, if the fund goes broke, and if the insurance program called ERISA can't cover it, then the balance has to be covered by cutting the pensions, both the people who are currently drawing the pensions and the people who are now working and looking forward to future pensions. Not eliminating them, but cutting them and making it possible for the fund to exist without using tax money to bail itself out. Now, the Democrats have just introduced a bill to require the tax money be spent to bail out the pension funds without any management reform of the system, without any redirection of their holdings. Obviously, the correct answer in this situation, where the stock market has tripled or quadrupled its value, and where Treasury bills are still, 1% or 2%, is to let the pension funds that are in serious trouble diversify their investments. Let them buy stocks and blue chip stocks and stuff like that, so that they can get a better return and live off this very good economy that we're increasingly having. But the Democrats don't want that, because ultimately they want all the pensions to come from the federal government, part of their expansion of federal power. And so they have introduced a bill which would amount to a bailout of those multi-employer plans and probably of all pension plans in the country. This is where the next raid on the Treasury is coming, in the same way that the subprime crisis led to massive raids on the Treasury. So I just want to warn you about this one, and stay tuned. Now, remember when Obamacare was passed, they said the reason you need it is by providing insurance where you could get coverage for all your medical expenses, including routine doctor's visits and maintenance of your health and checkups and early treatment of illnesses. And they said that we are currently overcrowding emergency rooms because poor people have nowhere else to go. They don't have doctors who service them, and Medicaid, in many cases, they're not poor enough for Medicaid. So we need to have Obamacare. Well, now that it's passed, half of all medical care in the United States is now delivered from emergency rooms. Half, which is absolutely incredible. A big expansion, almost a doubling of the ratio that comes from emergency rooms. And it has the same problem that it had before, which is that they get overcrowded, people die because the triage can't get to them, and there is no continuity of care. Nobody knows what other drugs the guy has in him. Nobody knows what the chronic conditions are, and there's never a long-term treatment plan. And these problems, which are supposed to be made improved by Obamacare, have unfortunately just been worse and worse. There is another example coming in, kind of like the state of the city of Detroit, in the state of Illinois. There are a whole series of states now that have been run huge deficits and can't cover their own pension obligations. And they're raising taxes, they're refusing to cut spending, they're refusing to cut pensions, even of people who've not retired yet. They're admitting more and more state employees under the old pension system, and they're just literally headed over a cliff. And once again, we, the national taxpayers, are going to be asked to bail these folks out. And we want to not do that. And we want to try to intervene early enough so that we can stop this from happening. Illinois is the number one state at this point, literally on the verge of total bankruptcy and the verge of a need for massive federal intervention. Unfunded state and local retirement debt in Illinois is more than $260 billion and rising. Unfunded pension liabilities in Illinois go to the nation's highest paid government workers who work in Illinois. Overtime starts at 38 hours. There are 130 billion for unfunded pension liabilities, and they're expected to increase through the next decade. Nearly a quarter of the state's funds go to retirees, many living in Texas or Florida. Vendors are owed $10 billion. Every 5 minutes, the population drops by another person. It's over a 10-year period. It's dropped 1.2 million in Illinois, and every 5 minutes somebody else moves out. The people who move out pay an average of $30,000 of disposable income. They had the largest tax increase in history in 2001, and all it did was deepen the deficit. And Illinois, which refuses to do more to curb its spending, is really riding for a catastrophe. The latest tax increase, forced by the legislature to end a 2-year budget impasse, raised more than $4 billion, but another $1.7 billion has already appeared as a deficit that this tax increase will not address. Just a big red flag, particularly if you own bonds from the state of Illinois. It's going the same way Detroit has gone, and Santa Barbara, and a whole lot of cities. Now, I have an idea that I've been pressing that becomes really relevant in light of this. And I've run it by a bunch of folks in Washington, and particularly Newt Gingrich liked the idea. What we should do as the Congress is go to these states and say, we will offer you assistance. We will help bail you out if, and only if, you declare bankruptcy. In fact, we need to change the law to permit states to declare bankruptcy. And in that bankruptcy, wipe away all union collective bargaining agreements the state has entered into. In the context of a bankruptcy, you can do that. Regularly, private companies do that as a precondition of bankruptcy. We should do the same thing in the public sector. Wipe away the wage agreements, the salary agreements, the hours, the overtime, all that stuff, and build from scratch and have a stable financial system. And this is important because many, many cities and states are planning to travel the same route as Illinois is now traveling. And we should set up a precedent where if this happens, Congress can use this to get a state to declare bankruptcy and free itself from these collective bargaining agreements that are running it absolutely into the ground. And as other states like Connecticut and Michigan all come afoul of this financial situation, we should wipe out those collective bargaining agreements just like you would in an airline bankruptcy or any other bankruptcy situation. Now, there's another event that's unfolding, which is fascinating and which is good. The Dodd-Frank bill that was passed under Obama is about to be revised considerably by a new piece of legislation co-sponsored, get this, by 9 Republicans and 10 Democrats, all in the Senate. Completely bipartisan approach. And that is so rare in Washington, they should take space in the museum to show it. And what they're doing is working on changing Dodd-Frank from legislation that protects the huge banks to one that protects the smaller community banks. What's been going on since Dodd-Frank passed is that the small banks in each community, there were 850 of them now, there are fewer than 600 of them, are getting clobbered by federal regulation, both in terms of the amount of staff they have to pay to meet it and the limitations on what they can do with their money, and most significantly, limitations on their ability to lend money. So on one hand, you have the federal government pumping out currency for loans by quantitative easing, but on the other hand, the Federal Reserve saying, nope, you can't lend the money out because this loan could go bad. The result of this push-pull is a drying up of the credit market in small communities from small community banks. And by small communities, I don't mean farms. I just mean municipal banks, not Citibank, not Morgan, not the banks that are all over the world, but, the corner national bank that has existed in your neighborhood and your community for a long time is now finding that under Dodd-Frank they can't make the loans that they want to make. And in fact, under Dodd-Frank, if they make the loans and the loans go bad, they not only lose the capital from the loan, but the feds are obligated to step in, take over the bank, forcibly merge it into a larger bank, and fire the employees, fire the directors, deprive them of their pensions, pay the use of the pension funds to pay the bank's loans back. And the result is that these loan executives won't approve loans, even if it's clear that they ought to, and it's clear that it's a good investment, and it's clear that they'll make money from it. They would rather put their money into federal treasury bonds, which are secured and guaranteed by the government. And if they go bad, they don't lose their pensions, they don't lose their jobs, and they don't lose their banks. Over 200 community banks have been closed or forcibly merged into large banks that don't come from any community, don't give a damn about a community, and basically are money market funds for big, huge multinational corporations. But the problem is that those who are being punished by Dodd-Frank and regulated by Dodd-Frank are not the people who screwed up the credit markets. They were not the cause of the '07 and '08 crash. The big banks have been bailed out by Dodd-Frank and heavily regulated, but ultimately they can take it in stride. They have enough money to pay the auditing staff and to fill out the paperwork and to do everything necessary to be on the good side of the regulators. Whereas the small banks find that harder and harder to do, and the pressures for them to fold into the big banks mount rapidly, killing the small community banks that are the basis of our financial system. Why has Obama wanted these banks to go bust? Why has he encouraged closing them down? Because he's a socialist. He wants a planned, regulated economy. And to do that, you've got to regulate the supply of credit. If everybody can lend anybody whatever they want and take their risks and make money if it works out and lose it if they don't, you can't plan the economy. You can't control it out of Washington. You need to get rid of those banks and have 1 or 2 or 10 or 7 large banks that control everything. And then they can make deals with the government on where to lend their money and where to plan economic growth, and always to plan it in the wrong place. Terrible track record. But Dodd-Frank encourages that. And now this legislation is to give preference to small community banks, protect them from federal regulation. Right now, if a bank is bigger than $50 billion in assets, it has to put up jumping through the hoops of massive federal regulation. What this bill would do is raise that threshold to $250 billion, giving the Fed the option of lowering it to 50 in specific cases where it believes the bank is being mismanaged and is at risk. But that'll take a huge amount of the banking industry and return it to local control, return it to bankers who know the community, know the people they're borrowing from, are taking deposits from the community and lending money to the same community. And that healthy bloodstream of veins and arteries really sustains many communities economically. And what they're doing is trying to ratchet back the regulation of these smaller banks while strengthening them of the big boys who are the ones who invested unwisely and led directly to the subprime crisis. So I think that's a very good step and a very positive one. I'm sorry that I've not been able to take your comments or questions soon, and Renee will be back soon, and she will. Now, I will not be broadcasting on Thursday or Friday, Thanksgiving or the day after, but I will be back on Monday. If you got another minute, I'd love just to tell you a great story about Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving, as you know, celebrates the immigration of the Puritans from Britain to Massachusetts. That was the second big migration into the colonies. The other one was 30 years before, when Britons came from Britain and went to Virginia in the Jamestown colony. Jamestown was 1607. The Plymouth Bay colony, I think, was 1630 or 35. But those immigrations were completely different kinds of people. In fact, they were opponents of each other in Britain. The British Civil War was between the Cavaliers, who were royalist-oriented, believed in the class system, believed in the wealthy and the aristocracy having power, against the Roundheads, who were the Puritans, who lived simple lives, opposed luxury, believed in leveling and not having class systems, and they were the Roundheads, Puritans. And ultimately, the Civil War in Britain was the Puritans against the Roundheads. Well, the Roundheads went to Massachusetts, and the Cavaliers went to Virginia. And that's how the American Civil War started. Because basically the immigrants who came to the United States from Britain in the early years of the 17th century tended to be royalists who fled when Charles I, the king, was beheaded, and the monarchy abolished, and the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell declared. In reaction, and a sort of terror at that, the Cavaliers, the rich people, the nobility, left Britain and moved to Jamestown. And that was the basis of the Confederacy in the Civil War. That was the basis of the pro-slavery, anti-equality aristocracy that developed in the South. Then, when the English Civil War progressed further and Cromwell died, and the British people wanted a restoration of the monarchy because the Commonwealth was so draconian, you couldn't dance, you basically couldn't smile, you couldn't do anything. It was a terrible theocracy, not unlike Iran is now. And when that happened, the Roundheads, the Puritans, were caught flat-footed because the people wanted the Cavaliers back in power, and they reacted against the Puritans. So they got the hell out of Britain because they were basically forced out. So Massachusetts got populated by small landowners, manufacturers, small entrepreneurs, day laborers, immigrants, people who believed in a level society, not in one which is hierarchic and aristocratic. And that became the Union side in the Civil War. And the differences between the backgrounds of those two regions, the North and the South, have so dominated those regions since the Civil War that many of those differences continue today, even in the face of massive shifts within the U.S. population. Very interesting idea and an interesting theory. Well, thanks a lot, and I will see you on Monday. Thanks for tuning in.